Hi everyone. For my curriculum project, my learner profile and lessons are based on an 8th grade ELA class for students with IEPs performing multiple grade levels below. Throughout the presentation, I'm not going to read directly from the slides, but I will sum them up and add information that is not on them. So my focus learner for my project is an 8th grade student with an IEP. She's an emergent bilingual who speaks Spanish. She moved here from Venezuela when she was in 3rd grade. And she has Gorlin syndrome, which has required her to have multiple surgeries throughout her life. And she has visual difficulties. So she requires large print items. She benefits from having things like the vocabulary chart filled out and given to her ahead of time so that she can look off of that to fill out her own vocabulary chart instead of straining her eyes looking up and down at the board as we fill it out as a group. My key takeaway was that my focus learner's profile helped me think beyond simply providing accommodations and instead consider how her strengths, interests, language, and learning needs could inform the design of instruction. For my lessons, I did 3 sequential differentiated lessons on vocabulary, starting with recognition of the new vocabulary words, application of the vocabulary words, and then moving into independent production using the words in their own sentences or stories. The progression of the lesson plans explicitly increases independence and complexity across the 3 lessons. Designing for all learners and developing expert learners. I wanted to keep the learning goal consistent while the pathways to reach it varied. And I wanted students to become increasingly responsible for their learning rather than remaining dependent on teacher support. UDL guided my planning. I used the 3 UDL principles, specifically the framework from Table 8.6 and Chapter 8 of our textbook, to think through lesson elements, potential barriers, materials, and UDL methods. Challenge and support. So this slide addresses how the lessons provide appropriate challenge while ensuring learners receive the supports needed for success. So high expectations and appropriate scaffolding. The supports do not remove the learning expectation. They reduce barriers that could prevent students from demonstrating the expectation. Potential barriers and how I address them. So rather than waiting for barriers to appear, I attempted to anticipate them during the planning process. I'm trying to work on being more proactive than reactive in my teaching practices. So some potential barriers that I thought of were linguistic barriers. So I provided the Spanish vocabulary chart, and encourage the students to translanguage with each other, with other emergent bilinguals in the classroom. Cognitive processing, so we chunked the information, explicit modeling and gradual release, visual access, academic barriers, and then social barriers. I also thought of engagement, attendance and environmental, written expression, like different ways to help them access writing, speech to text, alternative methods of expression, and then potential confidence and frustration barriers that could come up. So, culturally responsive and inclusive instruction. So, for culturally responsive, students' home languages are treated as assets throughout the lesson. And Spanish resources were provided. As I mentioned before, translanguaging was encouraged. Vocabulary was connected to lived experiences by asking the students questions using the vocabulary words in context. It was inclusive because it was the same essential learning goals for all students, but multiple pathways to those goals were provided. There was flexible grouping if the students wanted to choose partners, student choice in how they expressed their learning, different methods of participation, restorative practice. So, restorative practices, upon reflecting, were not explicitly incorporated into these lessons. So, for future consideration, I could use more intentional opportunities for students to listen to one another. I could have the students reflecting and sharing experiences, and then that could be could contribute to like building our community. What I learned. So, I learned that differentiation needs to begin during planning. The same goal can have multiple pathways, and student information should influence instructional design. I also learned that assessment should inform instruction. So, like using that informative assessment in the second lesson to then determine how I was going to do the third lesson. And then support should promote independence. So, that's definitely something I know I need to work on in my teaching is that gradual release so the students take more ownership in their learning and expressing it instead of being very dependent on me. How this will influence my future planning. So, going forward, as I mentioned before, I'm going to begin by identifying potential barriers, using pre assessments to more consistently identify student readiness, considering the student's strengths, interests, cultures, and languages when I'm designing the instruction, building those multiple pathways for them to engage, represent, and express their learning, using informative assessment throughout the process to adjust my instruction rather than waiting. So, more of that proactive than reactive. The gradual fade of scaffolds so that the students can become more independent, creating intentional opportunities for students to self monitor and goal set. I know that's definitely something I need to work on. And then continuing to develop my culturally responsive and restorative practices. My biggest takeaway is that inclusive instruction is not about lowering expectations. It's about intentionally removing unnecessary barriers that all so that all students have meaningful opportunities to meet our high expectations. Thanks for watching my presentation, and I look forward to any feedback that all of you may have for me. Thank you.